Yurri, Yaori, Quinkin, Yahoo, Yowie. The many names attributed to Australia's legendary hairy man. Australia is covered in dense bushland, a lot of which remains untouched by human hands. While I was never taught by my parents to fear the bush, I was always told to be careful, considering how many people have gone missing in the area where I grew up. There are a million reasons why that could happen to someone. Landslides, heat exhaustion, snakebite. Some of these people are eventually found, a few never are. It is always a tragedy when someone dies like that, but at least in the cases where a body is found, we can determine what happened to them, grieve, and learn. This is why the cases of people vanishing completely have always terrified me. While it could have been like any of the other accidents that happened in the bush, there is no way to be 100% sure. That void where certainty belongs demands to be filled, and for many it is filled by a monster. The Yowie. Like most staples of Australian culture, the Yowie is rarely taken seriously. To many, the Yowie is a ghost story, and to many more, a discontinued brand of chocolate. But to a few, the Yowie is a very real part of our ecosystem. A tall, hairy creature that on occasion preys upon humans and kills them. Sightings of the Yowie have taken place across Australia's history, from the present day to early colonial times and further back still into stories of the dreaming. Since colonisation, these sightings have often been written off as tall tales. However, upon reviewing the history of Yowie sightings, I began to see that nearly every account describes near to the same thing. The sound of crashing trees, followed by an intense smell and an overpowering sense of dread. And then from the bush emerges an 8-foot-tall mass of red-brown fur. Whether there is such a thing as a Yowie, there must be an explanation for the Yowie phenomenon. Across the vast history of our continent, why do Australians keep seeing these hairy men? Who are they? What are they? And if this creature does not exist, then what are people seeing? And why? Is the Yowie a monster or an illusion? Here is my hunt for the Yowie, and what I discovered about Australia's most enduring cryptid, and man's fear of the unknown. While I entered this investigation a skeptic, I was willing, if not wanting, to be proven wrong. Explaining disappearances as the fault of a monster is terrifying, but yet in my mind it was comforting compared to no explanation at all. During my search for information on the Yowie, I came across the work of Dean Harrison, a Yowie expert and survivor. After surviving several Yowie encounters, Dean has since pledged his life to finding definitive proof of the Yowie's existence. Dean also runs the Australian Yowie research website, which serves as a database of Yowie sightings and a forum for witnesses to discuss their experiences. I reached out to Dean to ask what the Yowie is and what evidence supports its existence. I was surprised to learn that it is the theory of many Yowie believers that the monster could be, in fact, an unrecorded species of ape. According to Dean, the Yowie has dark red fur, large, long arms, and a flat face, which some people have compared to that of a baboon or orangutan. The Yowie also stands at around 8 feet tall and uses its powerful arms to swing by trees. While this was a certainly more believable description of a creature than that of a spectre or a green-skinned gremlin, it still posed a number of questions. As of yet, there are no recorded fossils of primates in Australia, and how can an ape get so big? Fortunately, Dean had answers to both my questions. Here is the Yowie expert case for the Yowie, or rather, Australia's great ape. Gigantopithecus was a giant hominid, or ape, that lived anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 years ago. It is believed to have been able to stand at 8 feet tall, have been covered in red or brown fur, have a flat face like that of an orangutan, which is its closest living ancestor, and to have had long, powerful arms. A nearly identical description to the many Yowie sightings we have today. Yet Gigantopithecus has been dead for over 100,000 years. Dean reminds me that Australia was once connected to the rest of the world by a land bridge. Supposedly, one of the many giant apes living in Asia at the time could have crossed into Australia long ago, evolved in the bush, and eventually would have become isolated from the rest of the world when the land bridge disappeared 7,000 years ago. Following that information, I asked that if Yowies are in fact descendants of such large creatures, then why are they not seen more often, living or dead? Dean tells me that if we are operating with the theory that Yowie is indeed an ape, it is safe to say it is social and intelligent. The theory is that Yowies likely operate in clan-based societies like other primates, living and hunting together. If one were to die, another Yowie would be nearby to bury it. While the burying of dead is not something that has been observed as common practice among modern primates, Dean refers to the Neanderthals and how they buried each other hundreds of thousands of years ago. This begged the question, what of the odd few who die away from the group? Bodies of ancient humans have been found unburied after being killed out in the wild. Why not Yowies? Dean is quick to remind me that Australia is a large continent, similar in size to the United States of America. Whereas the United States has 300 million people, Australia has under 30 million. Much of our country remains uncharted, and even more unsettled. As such, it is Dean's belief that the discovery of Yowie remains is only a matter of time. I began my research as a skeptic, and remain so even after talking to Dean. Yet in my mind, his points did make a fair deal of sense. Australia did once have a land bridge in the north, and giant apes did once reside close to it. In my mind, the suggestion that a giant ape, such as Gigantopithecus, could have crossed into Australia and lived in the bush did not seem totally implausible. Even near supernatural abilities such as glowing eyes did not seem completely impossible when considering the many other strange animals that live in Australia and their even stranger niches. However, I could not be certain that a giant ape roamed the bush just yet. I decided to test the giant ape theory and ran it by paleobiologist Hervé Boucherens to determine whether a gigantic hominid from thousands of years ago could have come to Australia. Hervé Boucherens is a paleobiologist and professor at the University of Tübingen. He had this to say about the giant ape Yowie theory. The current consensus is that there was never a terrestrial land bridge between Asia and Australia, but always a significant seaway to be crossed to reach Australia from the landmass of Asia, even when the sea level was at its lowest during the peak of glaciations. Otherwise, many more terrestrial species would have migrated from Asia to Australia, and this is clearly not the case. Moreover, during the low sea level periods, the vegetation was more savanna than forest, and Gigantopithecus was restricted to forest habitats. Based on expert opinion, it seemed as if Gigantopithecus, my theorized Yowie culprit, most likely could not have crossed into Australia. While other giant hominids such as Meganthropus existed close by, it does not change the fact that what is considered the land bridge was likely, for the most part, underwater. Even if the land bridge was in fact land, like it was during the low glacial periods, there would be little reason for a forest animal to cross it. It should also be noted that it is believed giant hominids such as Gigantopithecus went extinct as there was no longer enough food to support their massive size. Hervé states that while there is always a chance Gigantopithecus could have found the food it needed to support itself in Australia, we cannot be sure. More importantly, there is likely no way for it to have crossed into the country in the first place. I must admit, I kind of hope that the giant ape theory was in fact the explanation for the Yowie phenomenon. Unfortunately, according to science, that theory is unlikely. However, if a giant ape does not exist in the Australian bush, then what are people seeing? And why are the descriptions almost always the same? Across history, people have had similar visions all over the continent. But why? I decided to review the history of Yowie sightings once again to see if there was some explanation for the mass phenomenon that is the sightings of the hairy man. Recorded sightings begin in the 19th century with a creature known as the Yahoo. According to Dean, the Yahoo is now considered another name for the Yowie. A piece in the Australian Town and Country Journal from 1876 details the Yahoo phenomenon. Who has not heard from the earliest settlement of the colony, the blacks speaking of some unearthly animal or inhuman creature that inhabited some part of the wildest, inaccessible, rugged, and sequestered haunts of rocky mountains and gorges in the colony, namely the Yahoo, Devil Devil, or the Hairy Man of the Wood, which to this day they stand in fearful awe and terror of. Following this article, naturalist Henry James McCooey claims to have spotted the creature in Bateman's Bay in 1882. He describes the creature as tailless with very long black hair, which was of a dirty red or snuff colour about the throat and breast. McCooey's account and the piece in the Australian Town and Country Journal suggest that by the late 19th century, the Yahoo was a topic that was discussed throughout the country. In a 2003 journal article, historian Graham Joyner supports this, stating that there are accounts from 1842 of naturalists debating the creature's existence. The piece also refers to First Nations accounts of the Yahoo, suggesting that sightings have in fact occurred long before Europeans came to Australia. Graham Joyner, who wrote the 2003 journal article, Scientific Reaction to Evidence for the Yahoo or Australian Ape, has also written several articles and books on the Yahoo and Yowie, including Monster Myth or Lost Marsupial, The Search for the Australian Gorilla in the Jungles of History, Science and Language, an infamous text amongst Yowie hunting circles. Throughout his work as a historian, Joyner has explained how the Yahoo was in fact a story introduced by Europeans. According to Dean, the word Yahoo is an indigenous word. However, Joyner states that the term Yahoo was brought over to Australia by Europeans and introduced to First Nations Australians who would go on to repeat the phrase, making it appear indigenous. According to Joyner, there is no evidence to suggest that the term Yahoo came from an indigenous source. However, it has been used by Europeans since before the British even landed in Australia. The term Yahoo famously appears in Jonathan Swift's 1726 novel, Gulliver's Travels. The protagonist Lemuel Gulliver encounters a race of violent, hairy men called the Yahoo in an undiscovered country. Sounds familiar. At the time, Gulliver's Travels was an incredibly popular book, with English dramatist John Gray stating, "It is universally read from the Cabinet Council to the nursery." As such, many European settlers would have likely been familiar with the image of a giant hairy man in an undiscovered land, and the phrase Yahoo. While the term Yahoo may have been introduced by Europeans, it is not enough to prove that the Yahoo story was fabricated entirely by them also. There exist many First Nation stories that are similar to the Yahoo that the myth could have come from. If Joyner is correct and Yahoo is an introduced word, there is still a chance First Nations people still had a similar hairy man myth before the arrival of the English, but called the creature by a different name. It is believed that one of these names is Dooligal. Dooligal is a word that has appeared in Durga and Darawal languages, the meaning of which, according to some linguists, is gorilla-like legendary creature. While this term could be a description of a creature like the Yahoo, Joyner claims that this phrase is in fact mistranslated. Joyner states that all available examples of the word Dooligal were not considered, and that upon reviewing every source, the word was found not to have an exact equivalent in English. According to Joyner, Dooligal refers to something akin to ghosts or spirits. A giant ape sought after by Europeans would be called Dooligal by Durga-speaking people because it is elusive or mythical. However, a few linguists have interpreted that to mean that because Durga-speaking people refer to the European ape myth as Dooligal, then Dooligal must mean giant ape. Joyner refers to an example of a linguist speaking to a Durga informant. The linguist asked why Dooligal was like a gorilla, to which the informant replied, "He is the gorilla type, but we call him in our tribe Dooligal, see." In defense of the Dooligal hairy man theory, the Darawal story Watanguri, the story of the hairy men, how the Banksias came to be, mentions a group of tall hairy men called the Dooligar. Darawal elder Frances Bodkin has written the story in her book Darawal Dreaming Stories, in which the tall hairy Dooligars, driven by hunger in a time of drought, kidnap a few Darawal children to eat them. The day is saved by another group of small hairy men called the Kuridjars, who prevent a war between the Darawals and the Dooligars by luring the hairy men into hollow Kurrajong trees and trap them there. The Dooligar people remain trapped in the trees while the little hairy Kuridjars keep watch on the branches and over time become the Banksia flower. The story ends by reminding the audience that the Duergars are constantly trying to escape and that the only thing holding them back is the watchful Curitjars. According to Joyner, Duergar was found in the Darawal language, of which the very similar Duergar exists in also. Furthermore, its description as a tall, hairy man is very similar to the Yahoo or Yowie. However, Bodkin reminds the audience in a foreword that these traditional stories exist to teach people how to live harmoniously with the land, stating, "The stories do not in themselves act as an instruction manual, rather they point the way and encourage the people to think, to learn, and to live. It is hoped that by sharing our stories, you too may be able to think, to learn, and to live in this land." The hairy men exist in this story to remind people that nature is protecting us in the form of banksia flowers, and by disrespecting nature by cutting down trees, we may unleash a monster such as the Duergar. Even in this instance, where a hairy man story does exist in indigenous culture, the guiding moral of the legend is far different from modern tales. The story of the Duergar has a message about looking after the earth for our own good, whereas the 19th century Yahoo craze and modern Yowie myth just tell of a simple hairy monster. Furthermore, at the end of the story, the Duergar is trapped inside a tree, unlike the Yahoo or Yowie which continues to roam the bush. While this could mean the word Duergar may still refer to a hairy man as well as a ghost or spirit, the moral of the original story is hardly present in the current tales of Yowies and Yahoos. In either case, its part in the Australian ape theory is either the result of the mistranslation of language, like Joyner suggests, or the misinterpretation of a story. In my mind, the Yowie theory's remaining credibility hinged on the thousands of years of alleged witnesses. In the case of Duergar and Duergar, however, these accounts of supposedly giant apes were likely the result of misunderstandings. I began to wonder how many First Nations accountings of great ape-like monsters were just stories that were simply misunderstood on the part of Europeans. The supposedly vast history of Yowie sightings was beginning to narrow dramatically. But what of the word Yowie? Is it an indigenous word meaning monster or giant ape, or a misunderstood term like Duergar? Rex Gilroy, who is often credited as the father of Yowie research, famously helped popularise the term Yowie on the Australian Broadcasting Commission's radio show AM on the 5th of May, 1975. Graham Joyner claims in Monster, Myth or Lost Marsupial that before this radio show, the Yowie did not exist as a word or concept. However, authors Tony Healy and Paul Cropper have incidentally countered this argument, claiming in their book, Out of the Shadows, Mystery Animals of Australia, that an instance of the word Yowie appears over 10 years before Gilroy's interview. This account comes from 1964 from amateur historian Percy J. Gresser, who claims to have heard the term used by the Mulgoa and Baruggarong people and by other First Nations individuals throughout the Blue Mountains and toward Bathurst. Gresser states that the word was used to refer to hairy giants that lived nearby. I decided to investigate the claims put forward by Healy, Cropper and Gresser to determine whether the definition of Yowie truly refers to giant hairy men, and if the term Yowie actually existed before Gilroy's 1975 interview. Firstly, Joyner has theorised in Monster, Myth or Lost Marsupial that Gresser's encounter with the word Yowie is in fact an isolated use of a phrase which has descended from the word Yahoo. As previously discussed, Joyner has also stated that Yahoo is a word that was introduced by Europeans. The languages spoken by the Mulgoa and the Baruggarong people are that of the Darug and Gundungurra nations respectively. Healy and Cropper claim Gresser took interest in indigenous groups in the Blue Mountains and further west toward Bathurst, which is all Darug and Gundungurra land. I attempted to reach out to experts in the Darug and Gundungurra languages. I sought to determine whether the word Yowie is used in these languages, and whether or not the term could have been introduced like Joyner claims. While I was unable to find an expert in the language of the Gundungurra people, I managed to contact Jasmine Seymour, a Darug author who is currently running the Darug Dalang Revitalization Program. The word Dalang meaning language in the language of the Darug people. I was told that the program has not discovered any evidence to suggest that the word Yowie is of the Darug language. Apparently the word Yowie has been used by Darug people before in reference to hairy men, but Jasmine suspects that the word has likely been borrowed. Currently it is unclear where the word was borrowed from. While I was unable to confirm whether this was also the case in the language of the Gundungara people, Gresser has claimed to have heard the term Yowie in areas that are Darug country. If Jasmine's theory is correct, then many instances of the word Yowie which Gresser heard could have been introduced terms, supporting Joyner's claim. As Joyner details in Monster, Myth or Lost Marsupial, there are little to no credible examples of the word Yowie being used before 1975. The only other word that sounds similar to Yowie that translates to hairy man also would be Yahoo. Healy and Cropper do make mention of 3 other words: Yaori, Yurri and Yaru, which they claim was used by people in the Bateman's Bay and Bega areas as far back as 1930. However, they have provided no sources to support this claim. If the only instance of the word Yowie as a term for hairy man before 1975 is Gresser's account, then it is quite possible that this case of the word Yowie has in fact descended from Yahoo. The word Yowie is believed to be introduced to the Darug language, of which Gresser would have most likely heard the term used in. As such, it is quite likely the word Yowie was either created by Rex Gilroy, as Joyner suggests, or is derived from the term Yahoo, a term that has been used by Europeans since before the English even set foot in Australia. There does exist another possible source for the word Yowie. While the word may not have come from the people Gresser spoke with, Yowie could have still originated from an indigenous source. A possible origin for the word Yowie is the language of the Yuwaalaraay people from northwestern New South Wales. The Australian National Dictionary states that the word Yowie is derived from the Yuwaalaraay word Yowie, which means dream spirit. I reached out to Gamilaraay Yuwaalaraay Guladha to determine whether this definition was accurate. Gamilaraay Yuwaalaraay Guladha is an online resource for learning and preserving the Gamilaraay and Yuwaalaraay languages. Its members provided me with multiple sources. According to the book Grammar of Yuwaalaraay, the word Yowie does mean spirit or dream. However, in the 2002 Gamilaraay/Yuwaalaraay dictionary, the word Dewey translates to spirit or dream. Lastly, there exists the word Yowie, which is pronounced almost the same as the term Yowie. According to Yuwaalaraay, the language of the Narran River, Yowie means a person's soul or spirit, said to hang around the body for 3 days after death, visible as light at night, and heard. While the word Yowie may have roots in the Yuwaalaraay language, the translations do not resemble anything close to the supposed 8-foot-tall ape of legend. It is also worth noting that the definition of these words is very similar to the definition of Dooligal. Again, we have another case of a word that has been attributed to the existence of giant apes, which has actually meant something intangible, like a spirit or a dream. As such, if the word Yowie is indeed borrowed from the Yuwaalaraay language, there is every chance that the word has come to mean giant ape, much the same way Dooligal could have. The possible origins of the word Yowie are most likely the result of non-Indigenous people misinterpreting a word or inventing a word entirely. It would appear the supposedly long history of the Yowie has actually been rather short. The stories of hairy men told by First Nations people differ greatly from the monstrous creature that supposedly stalks the bush today. The Yowie's manner, history, and even its name appear to be corrupted by colonial influences. To me, it seemed as if Australia's hairy man was sustained only by continual misunderstandings of First Nations stories, culture, and language. And yet, through all my research, I had still not answered the main driving question behind my investigation. Why do we keep seeing the Yowie? A psychological study of every living human who claims to have seen a Yowie was a bit out of my reach, considering my lack of resources and expertise. While this investigation could not produce an answer, it has developed a theory. The modern Yowie exists, not as a creature made of flesh and blood, but rather one of our minds. It is not sustained by kangaroo meat and the flesh of unfortunate backpackers, but rather by our oldest, most primal fear, the fear of the unknown. To understand how the Yowie has been conjured into existence, I decided to examine a very similar myth, the Yeti. The Yeti is believed to be a hairy biped that lives in the Himalayas and has been theorized by some to be the ancestor of a great hominid. Imagining the wild man, Yeti sightings in folktales and newspapers of the Darjeeling and Kalimpong hills is an article written by David Torrey and Anna Sawafal in the book Transcultural Encounters in the Himalayan Borderlands, Kalimpong as a contact zone. The article details the different Yeti myths and how foreign influence transformed a piece of humble folklore into a global phenomenon. There exist many cultures in the Himalayas. As such, there are many different traditional stories of the Yeti. While most of them regard the creature as a dangerous beast that can kill or kidnap humans, some cultures revere the Yeti as a mountain deity or a patron god of the hunt. This traditional story would be twisted in newspapers written in English. Across the region, there were still English-speaking people descended from colonial roots. Torrey and Sawafal describe how newspapers written in English, such as the Himalayan Times, pushed a sensationalist narrative of the Yeti. The authors use an extract of a 1952 article from the Himalayan Times as an example. They say the female is larger and more savage than the male. In hushed, lilting voices, they tell how the snow woman woos her mate and kills him if he refuses. And sometimes she kills him if he does not refuse. That is the legend of the Tibetan. However, Torrey and Sawafal claim that Yeti stories in newspapers written for a native Tibetan audience, such as the Milong, showed little interest in the Yeti phenomenon. News about the Yeti only appears twice, with the only other coverage relating to foreign attempts to find the creature. The authors state that after the Yeti myths were covered by English newspapers in the Himalayas, it would become a topic discussed in Western newspapers as well. Western explorers and naturalists would soon set off to find the creature and determine its place in the animal kingdom. Before long, the modern abominable snowman legend was born. There are clear parallels in the history of the Yeti and Yowie phenomenon. While both stories have roots in the folklore of indigenous peoples, they have both been adapted by Europeans and changed to create this hyperbolic narrative. All the while, the original story has almost been completely lost in translation. While legends of hairy men or strange entities exist in both cultures, it's difficult to see where the modern telling starts and the original telling ends. Much of what we know of the Yeti comes from sensationalist articles written by English newspapers. As for the Yowie, there is a chance much of the lore surrounding the creature was in fact fabricated by Europeans or exists as the result of the misinterpretation of First Nation stories and language. In the cases of both the Yowie and the Yeti, the indigenous peoples have a distinctly different relationship with the creature compared to the colonials. In the Himalayan Times and the Australian Town and Country Journal, a horrific monster that is known by the native population is described to an English-speaking audience. Yet for all the creature's supposed ferocity, as detailed in the Himalayan Times, the Milong suggests that Tibetans were uninterested in the beast compared to English speakers. Meanwhile, in Australia, legends of a hairy man such as the Guladha exist to teach a lesson, rather than tell of a creature that continues to roam the bush, hunting human beings. While Europeans have not fabricated either story entirely, it is clear that traditional stories from Tibetans and First Nations Australians have changed a fair deal after colonisation. Unlike the indigenous tellings of either story, the European versions are defined by the quest to find and prove that a creature exists as a real animal. In Tibet, it was Yeti mania, a craze that saw so many explorers come to Tibet that the government needed to introduce higher fees for expeditions. Meanwhile, in Australia, hunts for the Yahoo and the Yowie have been undertaken by amateur naturalists and explorers since the 19th century. In the words of Torrey and Sawafal, a mysterious wild being was therefore also perceived as a possible threat. In the imperial epistemology, there is no room for a blank space. Based on what I have learned on my Yowie hunt, I have come to believe that the modern Yowie myth is a monster created by non-indigenous people as a means of coping with an unfamiliar country. While First Nations hairy man stories do exist, they are far different compared to the modern Yowie craze. The case of the Yeti demonstrates how European settlers have appropriated characters from indigenous folklore before. Stories which have meant to have functioned as a lesson have been changed into a mission to hunt, capture, and catalogue an animal. But how can we be sure the Yowie does not exist? We can never be 100% sure anything does or does not exist. However, it is the opinion of experts that the giant ape theory is highly unlikely. Also, after considering the number of First Nations accounts of hairy men that may have been mistranslated, misunderstood, or appropriated, the supposedly long history of Yowie sightings is questionable at best. But why do so many people see the same creature? While the descriptions of hairy men in First Nations stories may have helped to create a shared image of the creature, popular media has also played a part in constructing the Yowie's image. Gulliver's Travels would have drawn an image of the Yahoo for a wide audience, much the same way Gilroy's interview would have illustrated the Yowie. While there is no definitive proof, it is not unreasonable to suggest that an early Australian settler who had read about the Yahoo in Gulliver's Travels would connect the creature in his book with a story they had heard from an indigenous person, especially after coming to a new country much like Gulliver. News media also has had a part to play in creating the modern Yowie. Newspapers have given descriptions of hairy men across Australia's history. The Yahoo and Yowie phenomenon has been accompanied with regular reporting on the creature, which usually describes its appearance. As such, most Australians would likely have near to the exact same image of the Yowie in their head. The fact that so many people have claimed to have sighted near to the same creature across history may seem strange. Yet when you consider how the description of the Yowie has circulated in newspapers, radio, and general conversation for almost 2 centuries, it hardly seems strange at all. But why has this creature been created? The Australian continent is vast and mysterious. Even today, much of the country remains unsettled. Since the first fleet arrived, people have been trying to make sense of the many unexplainable things that can occur in Australia's grand wilderness. Put yourself in the shoes of an English settler or convict. You have come from the other side of the world to an uncharted land. The trees, animals, climate are all alien compared to the grey skies and green fields of Europe. The venomous spiders, the sweltering heat, the infinite expanse of trees all appear hostile to you, and on occasion, someone disappears while wandering out beyond the settlement. You may encounter something out in the bush, something that your limited knowledge cannot comprehend. To be confronted with the realization that there are things beyond the knowledge of European science and reason would be terrifying. Desperate to fill the void created by uncertainty, the settlers constructed a monster. Patched together with pieces of Jonathan Swift, First Nations folklore, and pseudo-scientific theories, this motley monster has been assembled. As I said earlier, a flesh-eating creature roaming the wilderness is a terrifying concept, and yet it may serve as a small comfort when confronted by the unknown. Thanks to the Yowie, every disappearance can have a culprit, and every anomaly an explanation. In my opinion, people don't believe in this creature out of fear or vigilance, but rather out of hope that it exists. Even today, much of Australia remains untouched. In the modern age of internet and instant information, a person may still walk into the bush and be confronted with something they cannot understand. Desperate to make sense of what happened, they turn to the Yowie, the centuries-old explanation. The attempts to find the creature and prove its place in the animal kingdom are an extension of the old colonial desire to tame the unknown and at last give order to nature. If the Yowie can be found and catalogued, then nature can at last be tamed. I must confess, I am also guilty of thinking this way. Although I began my hunt a skeptic, I was driven by the frustration of not knowing what truly goes on in the deepest parts of the bush. Since I was a child, the great mystery of the wilderness on my doorstep has always been confronting, and I wanted to decode it. When I learned the Yowie could have been an ape, I felt excited, but most of all, I felt relieved. For me as a journalist, it would have been a major discovery, but for me as a person, I would have finally had the comfort of knowing. However, the reality of the Yowie took a lot more time and effort to find. I can now see that I also wished for the Yowie to be real, Not because it would have made the world bigger and more interesting, but rather it would have made it smaller and more palatable for my scared European brain. I kept thinking back to something Dean Harrison said. He reminded me that our country is absolutely enormous in size, and yet our population is just so small. In the great expanse, there could be a clan of giant apes, and we would just never know. The chances are incredibly slim, yes, but never impossible, never to that 100% mark. The fact that Australia continues to have so much untouched land that the existence of giant ape clans can still be a matter of discussion is in fact beautiful. While the bush is colossal and enigmatic, it is also a reminder that nature endures in this country, despite all the works of man. However, until something definitive is found, I think it is best that we make our peace with the unknown. Those of us whose ancestors hail from abroad are not this country's owner, but rather its guests. And as human beings, we are not the lords of nature, but rather just part of it. For as long as we exist on the earth, the secrets of nature will continue to evade us. The Australian bush is unexplainable because it is still in many places untouched by human hands. Instead of attempting to conquer and reduce this great land like the British Empire, we should be content with what remains of our beautiful environment. The bush does not need an explanation, but rather quiet appreciation. We will never fully understand it, and that is okay. While it lasts, we should be grateful that much of our country remains beyond our reach and our understanding. So, does the Yowie exist? Probably not, but we can never be 100% sure, and that is okay.